Okay, we're on to part 3 of the chapter in Wendell Berry's book entitled Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community. It's the last chapter in the book, which is, it's the last chapter in the book. So, this chapter is unusual in that it is so straightforwardly not really entirely about agriculture and farming, which Wendell Berry is often about, but it's about community, and it is here where Berry, I think, demonstrates that community is even more fundamental. In other words, that the agricultural situation, the economic situation, stems from our understanding or lack thereof of community. And it's in this particular part 3, where he shows himself to be as much of a communitarian as he's going to be. Communitarians, if you want to know what they are, if you don't know, look up Amitai Etzioni, Etzioni. But communitarians are contemporary critics of classical liberal ideology who are not necessarily socialists or communists or anything of the sort, but who are aware of the deficiencies of liberalism, as in classical liberalism, a la the American founders, or going back a step, John Locke, Adam Smith, critics of the deficiencies of that way of thinking and of the capitalist economy. So he shows himself to be very much a communitarian here, more than just about any place I've ever seen. He starts off this part by saying, much of the modern assault on community life has been conducted within the justification and protection of the idea of freedom. And then he goes off on a discussion of, well, what does freedom really mean? Is it the freedom of the individual, regardless of what community wants, what, say, family, neighborhood, and larger community wants? Or is it the freedom of the community, or within the community, or what is it? He references the Bill of Rights, and he says this freedom is not only the basic guarantee of political liberty, but it also obligates public officials and private citizens alike to acknowledge the inherent dignity and worth of the individual people. And this is a good thing. But the problem for Wendell Berry seems to be that this type of liberal freedom, the freedom of the Bill of Rights, goes too far. And I'll just pause and really hammer home the point that when I speak of liberal, I'm not referring to the liberalism of Democrats or Hillary Clinton or whatever, but the classical liberal theory of Locke and Jefferson and Madison and those types of folks. All right, so what Berry wants to do here is juxtapose the freedom of the individual with the freedom of the community. Now, when he says freedom of community, he doesn't, I think, mean the freedom of some sort of faceless entity that isn't made up of us, but rather that entity that is made up of us and how we interact with each other. And he calls that community. Now, he talks about how if we were to want to be certain about something, we would find that certainty more in the so-called moral law He says, the moral law, which is remarkably consistent from one culture to another, has to do with community life. It tells us how we should treat relatives and neighbors, and by metaphorical extension, strangers. The aim of the moral law is the integrity and longevity of the community, just as the aim of public law is the integrity and longevity of a political body. Now, so the moral law is important to Berry, and it is consistent, and I think it sounds like somewhat universal for him, but it really seems to exist within community. In other words, I take this to mean that it is not as possible for the individual on his or her own to obtain a knowledge and understanding that's effective of the moral law as it would be for the community. And he says a community, unlike a public, has to do first of all with belonging. It is a group of people who belong to one another and to their place. And that distinction between community and public becomes important as we move on into this third part of his chapter. He says, and in the traditional rural villages of England, there was no public place, but rather a common. A public, I suppose, becomes necessary when a political body grows so large as to include several divergent communities. So the commons can occur when we have a community small enough for people to know each other and to interact with each other as citizens. We have a public, in Wendell Berry's verbiage, if we grow so large that we cannot know each other, and we exist within a larger framework in which there are many communities. And that's kind of, well, it's not kind of, it's what we have now. So we can see this as kind of a critique and a questioning of the system that we have now, in which there's no way that we can operate as a commons or a community in the truest sense of the word, but rather we operate within a public where we have many so-called communities. Now, he goes on to basically argue that the public is not only a substitute for these more meaningful communities, but is destructive of them. He says when a public government becomes identified with a public economy, a public culture, and public fashions of thought, it can become the tool of a public process of nationalism or globalization that is oblivious of local differences and therefore destructive of communities. Well, I think that statement gets to the real heart of the matter for Wendell Berry. He sees communities which have distinction being destroyed by globalization, the globalization of the economy, which takes place within our own country as well as beyond, where everything becomes very homogenized and very much the same, and where smaller entities are wiped out and replaced by larger ones who are all the same, like, you know, the local little restaurant is obliterated by McDonald's and Burger King or whatever. But he also mentions nationalism here, which is this identification which is going on in a big way right now with some sort of identity as nation, race and nation, which when you think about it, when you really delve into it just a little bit, is not much of an identity, because in almost every country, well, I would have to say every country, really there's all these local regional differences which have, at least in the past, been very quite profound, and have given people a sense of pride and distinction and togetherness. So nationalism in that sense identifying with the nation as a whole, obliterates those lower levels of identity, which are, I think Wendell Berry would say, much more meaningful because they're real. Like, they're not just an idea of, oh, I'm a white person or I'm a Spaniard. Now we have identitarianism going on where some people argue that despite all of the differences that exist among the Europeans, there should be this white identity somehow. And so, that's an example that is more current than what Wendell Berry in this book would have acknowledged or been able to know about. But I think that's exactly what he's talking about. Is there such a thing as a white identity? Well, if there is, does it really give you any sort of real sense of belonging? Well, no, not if that white identity doesn't basically allow you to be able to count on your neighbor for something real, like help with your child care, or your like trade-off of goods that you might be able to have. Anyway, so Berry goes on. He's talking about the freedom as it exists for the individual or for the community, and it seems like a trade-off. Like in the type of society that emphasizes the public, there's great freedom supposedly for the individual to do what he or she wants to do. And there's not so much freedom for the community, which is diminished. But then again, is there freedom for the individual if he or she is not within the community? Well, let's take a look at what he says. He says there are two kinds of freedom: the freedom of community and the freedom of the individual. The freedom of community is the more fundamental and the more complex. A community confers on its members the freedom implicit in familiarity, mutual respect, mutual affection, and mutual help. It gives freedom its proper aims, and it prescribes or shows the responsibilities without which no one can be legitimately free or free for very long. So there he makes that fundamental connection between freedom and responsibility. The freedom of the community implies the responsibility of all to safeguard it. Then he says the freedom of the individual, by contrast, has been construed customarily as a license to pursue any legal self-interest at large and at will in the domain of public liberties and opportunities. So he's basically saying there, in the freedom of the individual, you don't have that same sense of responsibility or duty. Like, there's no necessary conclusion that in order to have that freedom, I must also have that responsibility. And to kind of illustrate this and do what Wendell Berry loves to do, which is kind of slap people in the face from time to time, he talks about liberation movements. And, we're usually kind of trained to think of liberation movements like the women's liberation movement or even African Americans' liberation movements as being entirely positive. But Berry does kind of look askance at these to the extent that they are liberation movements within the larger framework of sort of an individualism that exudes a selfishness and a closedness to maybe a more communal way of life. He says these two kinds of freedom, so understood, are clearly at odds, that is, the individual and the community. He says, in modern times, the dominant freedom has been that of the individual, and Judith Weissman believes correctly, I think, that this self-centered freedom is still the aim of contemporary liberation movements like feminism. It's not to say that women shouldn't be equal. And see, Wendell Berry's gotten kind of a rap for that, I guess, from time to time. But what he's trying to say is that such movements of feminism, let's say, don't go far enough, and that women in feminist movements, especially, a couple of decades ago, but I would say even now, mainly just want what men have. But Wendell Berry is questioning, okay, why do men want to have what they have? Okay, is that overall framework in which we sort of value what men have more than what women have, is that okay? Is that good? And he's pretty dubious about that. Now, he says, as a sort of aside, it's weird, we, in today's economy and culture, treat corporations as persons, as individuals. We've kind of taken it to that level. And he says there is a paradox in all of this. As the emphasis on liberty, on individual liberty, has increased, the liberty and power of most individuals has declined. Most people are now finding that they are free to make very few choices. That comment is tied up with that comment about corporations, because Berry sees the economy as a very heavy power force on people's way of life. So, we say that we're free because we can buy this, that, and the other thing, and we have, let's say we have the income to do that. We feel that we're free, but the economy constrains our choices and what we value to a great extent, in Berry's mind. In fact, he calls what we have a rootless and placeless monoculture of commercial expectations and products. So just wrap your mind around that. A rootless and placeless monoculture. In other words, we have this one globalized, universal, capitalist, commercial culture of commercial expectations and products. So there you go. He says we have no uniqueness, and we are dominated without knowing that we are. A lot of Wendell Berry reminds me of Jacques Ellul's criticism of the technological society, but it's even a bigger critique. Berry says that we are very dependent for our happiness on an economy that abuses us, along with everything else, in which one size fits all, in which there is really no tolerance for eccentricity. That's my word, but still. No tolerance for eccentricity, because the economy is there to basically supply the wants as well as the satisfaction of those wants for the vast majority of people. It does not have time or tolerance for those who deviate. So then he goes into what a community really would be. And here's another area where he may get into some trouble with folks. But he basically says that a community, if it is a real community, regulates the atmosphere within it. And he goes off on whether one should welcome into one's community those who clash with it. He says, for instance, would I welcome into my house any stranger who came proud of his bad taste, professing his love for vile people and proposing to offend almost everyone? Well, obviously his answer is no. He says, by the same token, I cannot see that a community is under any obligation to welcome such a person. The public, so far as I can see, has no right to require a community to submit to or support statements that offend it. So there you see the difference between the public and the community again. The public is under that obligation because of, in our country's case, the Constitution, but more generally just this larger public understanding that is made up, the public is made up of individuals who have more or less contracted to be protected by the state, yada yada. But Barry says that's not a community, and a community is a group of people who share common values. Well, we have lots of debates going on right now about this whole situation. Like, it's very complicated, right? When it comes to the issue of gay marriages, for instance. We have folks that say, no, I don't want to bake a cake or arrange flowers for a gay wedding. And these cases are going before the Supreme Court. The question being is does a person have a right to be accommodated in those types of services? In the civil rights movement, we had that question regarding, whether African Americans could sit at the lunch counter or be accommodated at a hotel or motel. And the answer was they must, okay? And now we have this question of whether gay folks fall under the same criteria. And again, I think I said in my last video, I doubt if Wendell Berry would, if pressed, would say no, they shouldn't be accommodated. But at the same time, and I think rightly so, he's trying to explore what it takes to really build a community. And I think he's bringing out the tension here that we all need to understand, that a community, a real community, means some exclusion, means that not everything goes, that people within that community have the right to define the people they want to be around, and this is part of what it takes to build a community to a greater extent than just living in the same neighborhood with somebody. But it's really fraught with issues. And none of us, at least none of us who have a decent sense of justice, want to say a community involved excluding certain people, right? But so I'm just saying it's really complicated, and I think Wendell Berry understands that, but he's not willing to give up on the idea. Okay? I mean, this is a problem that we need to grapple with rather than sort of tossing it off as either obviously we can't have any sort of community standards, or obviously we have to discriminate against people, whether they be gay or whatever they may be. We need to grapple with it. How do we have a community in the world that we have today, with the values that we want to espouse, that still has some sort of meaning to it? Well, he goes off onto a riff about, what would it take to really build that. Talks about how, maybe it would take people even homeschooling or at least, taking a much greater hand in how their children are educated. So maybe it means some regulation of what is served up at the local theater or at the at the local community center. But I'm uncomfortable with this to the extent that I personally understand that in order to grow as a human being and even as a member of a community, you need to be confronted by those things that make you uncomfortable. Those things that may make you see the humanity and the community worthiness of a person who's very different from yourself, but who still shares some root core values in common. But at the same time, I feel for what Wendell Berry's trying to say here. He, for instance, talking about art, he says, our public art now communicates a conventional prejudice against old people, history, parental authority, religious faith, sexual discipline, manual work, rural people, and rural life. Anything local or small or inexpensive. At its worst, it glamorizes or glorifies drugs, promiscuity, pornography, violence, and blasphemy. Any threat to suppress or limit these public expressions will provoke much support for the freedom of speech. I concur in this. But as a community artist, I would like to go beyond my advocacy of the freedom of speech to deplore some of the uses which are made of it, and I wish that more of my fellow artists would do so as well. So there he reminds me of Amitai Etzioni, the Communitarian, because he does want to recognize you have a right to offend, but at the same time, the community, if it's cohesive enough, has the right to say no, or to push back. And maybe it's in the give and take of insisting and pushing back that you can grow as members of the community. But I do sympathize with what he's saying. At the same time, I caution that in the past, as well as in the present, some people's notion of what the community means prejudices which I think many people find repugnant, of a racial nature or about sexual orientation, neither one of which really ought to matter enough that you would exclude somebody from your company. And again, I don't think Wendell Berry would argue with that at all. So in order to get the most of what we can out of Berry, we need to acknowledge that there's this tension and there's this slippery slope, and to acknowledge that he doesn't want to go there, and that maybe you don't have to go there, that you can get something out of what Berry's saying, knowing that if you take it to its extreme, of course, you get prejudice, but that you don't have to, and that maybe we need to still explore what community really means. He goes into, again, the sort of the extreme case of the right that people have to make pornography, and even child pornography, which everybody agrees is illegal, and yet people do it. And it does kind of, the fact that we allow people to go up right to the line makes it, in a practical sense, kind of hard to refute that it makes it more likely that such egregious things will occur. He goes on about privacy too, and this special right to privacy that we insist on in the public. But that right to privacy has its limits if one is thinking of community. And I'll just read a little bit here. He says, one of the essential trusts of community life is that which holds marriages and families together. Another trust is that neighbors will help one another. Another is that privacy will be respected, especially the privacy of personal freedom, feeling, and the privacy of relationships. All these trusts are absolutely essential, and all are somewhat fragile. But the most fragile and the most vulnerable to to public invasion is the trust that protects privacy. In our time, privacy has been the trust that has been most subjected to public invasion. There's a sort of inversion there because, the liberal mantra is the right to privacy. And I think that Wendell Berry is against that sort of liberal public mantra about the right to personal privacy. But remember what he said before in previous sections about the necessity of privacy in sexual relationships, that there is this zone where, there is no necessity for public involvement whatsoever. That zone is within the relationships between two sexual partners and what goes on in the privacy of their own home, because that has to do, hopefully, with love and with intimacy. That is the bedrock of all other relationships. So for Berry, you leave that privacy alone. And even within the small, tight-knit community, that is to be left alone. But when we look at what we really do in the type of society that we have, we look into the very personal and private lives of people. Pornography being the most obvious sort of commercialized example. But reality TV would be another one that just hits you in the face. Or so much of social media that, where people self-expose themselves. What should be private becomes excruciatingly public. Let's see. He says, one of the boasts of our century is that its artists have pried open the bedroom door at last and shown us sexual love for what it, quote, really is. We assumed, cracked the shell of sexual privacy. The resulting implication of that the shell is easily cracked disguises the probability that the shell is, in fact, not crackable at all, and that what we have seen displayed is not private or intimate sex nor sexual love, but sex reduced, degraded, oversimplified, and misrepresented by the very intention to display it. Sex publicly displayed is public sex. Sex observed is not private or intimate and cannot be. So he's brought the whole issue back to the central subject of this particular chapter, which is sexual relationships and their implication for the family and the larger community. So, it's kind of hard to deny that we have done this with relationships, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but it is, that our personal relationships are alienated and objectified, meaning that it's hard for us mentally to wrap our heads around the fact that we're looking at just another fellow human being in a relationship, in a romantic relationship, rather than we're looking at a type or a provider of certain benefits or whatever it may be. So all this should make us think about how the larger framework in which we live impacts our most private, supposedly intimate private relationships. How much of that outside world of liberal individualism, liberal materialism and self-interest is, and even realistic power politics, is involved in our personal, most supposedly intimate relationships. Now here's a mind blower. He brings this all back to his even larger issue of his beloved issue of agriculture and farming. He says on page 166, just as the ruin of farmers, farming, and farmland may be predicted from a society's failure to imagine food in all of its meanings and connections, so the failure to imagine sex in all its power and sanctity is to prepare the ruin of the family and community life and of much else. In order to expose the privacy of sex, we have made it another industrial specialization, leaving it naked not only of clothes, but of customary discretions and courtesies, but also of all its cultural and natural connections. Just as we have disconnected agricultural production from cultural and natural connections based upon place and upon familiarity with people as individual human beings, we have also done that with sex in exposing the privacy of sex in so many ways, through the media, through social media, and just through our personal objectification of our sexual partners or potential sexual partners, which is done by reflecting upon the commercial expectations that are put in front of our eyes all the time. He goes on about how doing so, commercialization and the media treatment of sexuality has destroyed the dignity of the body. There's very strong language here. He says to destroy the dignity of the body is to prepare the way for the enslaver, the rapist, the torturer, and the user of cannon fodder. The nakedness or near nakedness of some tribal peoples is in contrast always dignified, and this dignity rests on a trust so complex and comprehensive as to be virtually unimaginable to us. The public nakedness of our own society involves no trust, but only an exploitativeness that is inescapably economic and greedy. It is an abandonment of the self to self-exploitation and to the exploitation by others. Well, think of that the next time you take a selfie, and make sure you have some clothes on. Yeah. Alright, so we have one more part to go. It's a very short part, but I should have lots to say on it. Sorry about this going on for some length. And I'll see you next time for part 4.